Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Octaciano Miguel Valerio Mendoza, and this is my presentation given during a research seminar at the IQS School of Management of Universitat Ramon Llull in Barcelona on October 28, 2020. This research seminar is one of several knowledge transfer activities stipulated in the grant agreement of my current research project, which is funded by the European Commission under the Horizon 2020 program and hosted by the IQS School of Management in Universitat Ramon Llull. It is an introduction to the research I will be carrying out in the following 2 years with Dr. Flavio Comim and other members of our research team. Hope you enjoy the recording, which is titled Preferential Policies and Inequality in Urban China. In urban China. So it is a loaded title, and I will be dedicating some time to explaining what these terms mean, right? Because there's a lot of implication on why the preferential policies, why we're going to focus on inequality, and of course, why China, right? I don't know how familiar you are with China, but if you read in the news these days, right, and you see a lot about China, and you can see like they're leading in 5G. They're competing with the U.S. in supercomputing powers, right? If you look at the top 500 supercomputing best performing supercomputers in the world, China has most of them, right? They're the country with most supercomputers, and we see a lot of developments that are coming from China these days, especially in the fields of artificial intelligence as well. We see that they're not only competing with the US, they're over-investing more than the European Union, for example, in artificial intelligence. And combined with 5G, you can see that their applications are very unique. So China is a very interesting case right now in terms of development. And it's very important to understand how they got here because 4 decades ago, they were a very low income country and their development has been very outstanding. And if you look at normal development models, they oversimplify or fail to explain this development miracle, as they call it. And I'll give a little bit of background on this so that we can understand more and why I'm interested in this topic and why it is important not just to those interested in Chinese economics, but for those of us in Europe as well. So this research is an introduction to my current research project at IQS and is part of a research line that I started some years ago at Nagoya University. So a very small part, maybe less than 30% of the results I'm going to present today has already been published. And you can look at this article as well. I'll put it in the references. And basically, my current research project is a continuation of this research line. So since this will be the outline of today's presentation, and because of the diversity of the backgrounds and experience and disciplines of this target audience for today, I will dedicate several slides to the introduction, right, to introduce these topics. And please keep in mind that the seminar is aimed at PhD students at IQS School of Management. So at different stages of my presentation, I want to give an example, right? Actually, the whole presentation is meant to be an example of what key elements you should have in a research presentation and a research investigation as well. So we'll start with the motivations, right? Why is this topic important? Why am I interested in this topic? And what is the significance? And I'll elaborate a little bit on the key terms. So the Chinese special economic zones, and I'll explain what a special economic zone is because the definition is very important. And when you do a lot of literature review, you'll see that this word can mean many different things. So in the Chinese context, it's very unique, and I'll explain that. I'll explain it in detail. So the Chinese special economic zones are considered the most successful case for the use of preferential policies leading to economic growth. And currently, there are over a dozen countries that have preferential policy programs based on the Chinese economic growth model. And these are mostly developing countries, but they're trying to replicate the Chinese experience. And the Chinese experience, if you're unfamiliar, right? I mentioned earlier, China was a low-income country, and now they're upper middle income moving fast, right? Their target, actually, policy target, is to become a high income country by 2035, 2040. So that means they've experienced rapid growth at around 10% annually over the last 4 decades, right? Especially the first 3 decades, what they were consistently growing at over 10%, and now it's become slower, but still remarkably fast compared to other countries. And at the same time, they have been experiencing a rising inequality as well. So these are the two main ideas that we'll be examining. But I also want to mention that if you're part of the teams, right, I sent a link about Nobel laureate Paul Romer, and he has an idea, right, about how to take advantage or learn from the Chinese development model. And his idea is charter cities, and I've put it in the references, but there are a few videos, not that much literature because it's very new. But my research is actually very motivated by Paul Romer ideas. And because there isn't much research, I thought, well, I will do it, right? There is a research gap in this topic, so I wanted to contribute to this research gap. So inequality as well. Inequality is a hot topic now, but if you look at 16 years ago, the World Development Report of 2004, I think, considered inequality as a byproduct of development. So as countries become richer, their inequality grows. And once they reach a level, right, of advancement or of growth, their inequality is supposed to go down. And this is considered the Kuznets curve. And many economists and policymakers accepted that with growth comes higher levels of inequality. And I think there is no empirical evidence to support that. So the evidence is actually going on the contrary way, and it should no longer be expected that inequality should go down by itself, right? Policies should target the reduction of inequality, and inequality, as I'll explain, right, it can become a serious social problem for many countries. So it has been acknowledged by the United Nations as the number 10 Sustainable Development Goals. And my research tries to understand the linkage, right, between these two issues, right? Do these preferential policies lead to higher income inequality? So let's start with some background. What are preferential policies? It is a loaded word, and it's new. Right, we can see examples of preferential policies over the last 300 years, but they have been mainly used to promote trade, economic growth, capital inflows, and foreign direct investment. And you can see it, that they have been implemented at different scales around the world, right? And these have ranged from entire countries that serve as tax havens, and you might be familiar with some of these in Europe. Right? For example, Switzerland and Andorra don't have border, how do I say, ports, but they have been very successful in attracting investment, and they serve as tax havens and offer fiscal incentives, right, to corporations, banks, and people. And this is a type of preferential policy. And we can also see it in port cities. So many city-states along the British trading route, such as Singapore, Hong Kong, and Gibraltar, they served as duty-free and customs-free ports. And this promoted trade along these routes and allowed these countries, these regions to become develop at a faster pace. And of course, the most recent in the second half of the 20th century, we saw a smaller version of these preferential. So I've given an example of entire countries and some city states, and now we have within countries or cities small demarcated zones that are usually called export processing zones. And these were part of the export oriented strategies that we saw at the second half of the 20th century. And all of these are considered preferential policies. And all of them are oriented towards growth strategies. However, in China, the preferential policies were used different, very differently from all the previous cases. And this is because of the situation in China. The country from 1949 to 1979 was completely state managed, right? They were operating under the communist system, which was partly based on the Soviet system as well. And they had a state managed economy. And even though they did have some egalitarian advances in their society, the economic growth and the development in China did not occur as they expected. And they realized that they needed to change over to a market oriented economy. However, they were very afraid, and when I say they, right, I'm talking about the leaders at the time. They were very afraid to switch overnight, right, as occurred in some Central and Eastern European countries. And this caused a lot of havoc and maybe some uncertainty and some instability. So they did not want to make the change overnight, and they decided they will change from state managed to market oriented gradually over a long period of time, actually. And they are still undergoing this transformation, even 40 years after. So, how did they do that? Well, they had a national economy, right? China, as you see on the map, is a very big country. The territorial expanse is, I think, larger than Europe. So it's quite big, and they already had an integrated economy. So all these changes, they decided to make them in an experimental fashion. They were going to experiment, and whatever was successful, they would implement nationwide. So how did they do that? They chose four regions at the southernmost part of the country, and you can see on the map. And in these regions that were completely underdeveloped, these were rural places, and if anything failed here, it would not affect the rest of the country. That was very important, that the rest of the country was not damaged by these experiments. So they created these four special economic zones. And when they created the zones, actually, they were zones. They were, for example, in Shenzhen and Zhuhai, next to Hong Kong and Macau, and also in Xiamen, which is very close to Taiwan, right? So they wanted to create them close to these predominantly Chinese culture cities, right, that were already advanced. So they wanted to learn and attract investment from Hong Kong and Macau and Taiwan, and they thought these were the places to do. So they were going to experiment market-oriented policies. What does that mean? So the rest of the country was under the state-managed economy. That means there were no private enterprises. Private enterprises did not exist in all of China. There were no financial mechanisms, right? There were no banks, or the banks did not offer financial services. There were no prices. There were fixed prices. The government decided what the price was going to be, and there was no market mechanism, right, for the prices. And these are a few examples. Also, no foreign investment. No foreign companies were allowed to invest anywhere in China at this point. And these four regions were the exception. That's where the preferential policy comes from. The name preferential means that they had this advantage. They have the privilege of experimenting with prices, with investment, with financial services, as well as other market-oriented policies. And they didn't stop at economic growth, right? They actually tried with other like packages, welfare packages, compensation packages, healthcare, education. So it wasn't limited to just economic policies. But the idea is that only these regions had it, and the rest of the country didn't. And very quickly, it was a success. So these four regions started growing very rapidly, and they grew from basically very rural areas into cities. They grew into cities because they attracted a lot of the surplus labor in surrounding areas. And the government decided, okay, this market-oriented policies are a good thing. And the city scale, because they grew into cities, they let 14 other cities have these preferential policies. So they decided, okay, 14 cities along the coast, since they were actually primed, right? They were the cities that were probably most likely to develop faster, and they allowed them, okay? So the preferential policies and the autonomy of the special economic zones were extended to 14 coastal cities. then furthermore to 8 more cities along the Yangtze River, and finally to all provincial capitals. And this is the mechanism for reform in China. Uh, what does that mean? All policies that are going to be implemented nationwide are first experimented. Right? I think that's the correct word. They're experimented in some of these cities, not all cities. So it's actually it's it's a political, right? A policy experiment, and whatever succeeds can there is evidence to make it the case for nationwide reform. This is because there is only one party in China, it's the Communist Party, and for to convince the Communist Party of a change, of an important change, they need evidence. And this is very different to most Western countries, right? That they debate, right? We have different parties and they debate on the pros and cons of a policy, but they don't really know. And once you implement this policy, it's very hard to go back, right? It's very hard, and there are moral issues as well, right? If you're going to experiment with a policy, who gets to have it and who doesn't get to have it? Well, the Chinese government doesn't seem to have this problem, right? They really have this instrument where they can test out policies, and if they fail, if the policy fails, well, that's it. It failed in these uh, regions only. But if the policy is successful, then you have evidence to change the nationwide reform. And this is the mechanism, right? This is how the Chinese economy, and actually, well, let's focus on the economy, is transforming towards a market-oriented one. And this has been going on slowly at some points and faster at other regions. But if you look at the map again, right, we start at the coast and later to some central regions and finally the western regions. So the western regions were the last to receive these preferential policies. And actually, this is the wave of Chinese development. If you look at China, the coastal provinces are usually richer than the central provinces, and these are in turn richer than the western provinces. So these market-oriented policies did not reach the whole country at the same time. And then we have different uh, how can we say that? We have different Chinas. We have a China that is market oriented, and we have a China that is state managed still, right? Still. And there's a duality, right? There are dual systems, dual tracks, and and this is how the country is being managed, and this is how they are progressing actually. Right now, we have major technological advancements. For example, we have self-driving taxis in some cities, and self-driving cleaners. The trucks that clean the roads are completely self-driving, right? They're automated. They use artificial intelligence with the 5G, and you see them that they are only being applied in one of these cities. So the carbon trading system as well. Of course, because of the timeline, I will talk about some policies that are maybe 20, 30 years old, but still, there is a catch-up effect. So first, the policies are experimented in one of these areas, and then the rest of the country implements the same policy. So there is a catch-up effect. So they have to be continuously innovating because they still have preferential policies, but their policies keep changing. And I'll give some examples. But there's an important difference when you compare Chinese special economic zones or preferential policies to other countries. And the first one is the scale. They implemented them to cover entire cities. If you look at special economic zones in Latin America or in Africa or in India, they are zones within a city or zones outside of a city, but it's like a demarcated zone. In China, it's more like a jurisdiction. This city now has a certain autonomy from the central government, and they have an autonomy to try out different policies. And the policies can be economic, they can be financial, they can be social, educational, health. And they have this autonomy, and they from the central government. So this is what the preferential policies mean, and they are more comprehensive in terms of function. So it's not just economic growth, right, but also social programs. And this means they have less restrictions, right? They have deregulation to experiment with these policies, right, that affect labor mobility, prices, exchange, leasing, and so on. Uh, what else? They have used these policies, right, to develop infrastructure such as residential housing, facilities used for education, culture, healthcare purposes. So it's not just economic growth, right? It's very comprehensive. And this differentiates the model from other countries that have only used it to promote export, for example, or to just attract foreign direct investment. And the reforms, well, it's a mechanism for reforms. So I mentioned before, right, that over the last 40 years, China grew at about an average of 10%. But 10% is the national average. That means some parts of China grew much slower than 10%, and others grew much quicker, right? The first economic cities, right? It's now a city, Shenzhen, grew at almost 30% annually. So for many people, right, they will never experience this kind of growth. If you grow at 10% annually, every 7 years, your income doubles. You earn twice as much as you did 7 years ago. Well, in Shenzhen, it was growing at about 30%. That's every 4 years, incomes were doubling. So it's a transformation that people live through, right? And it creates an optimism that is seldom seen, or at least I seldom see it in other places, in other countries that have not experienced this growth in their lifetime. And how does this compare to other countries, right? So China is growing quickly, right? They have grown from a low income country to an upper middle income country. But you look at Shenzhen, and Shenzhen's GDP per capita, for example, is comparable to higher income nations. And this is not adjusted for purchasing power parity. It would be higher. This is just current amounts. So GDP per capita in Shenzhen is about 30,000 US dollars as of last year. We look at the preferential policies. I mentioned what they were at the beginning, but they've been changing. So they have different stages, and I think this is an important feature for us to understand that they're not constant. They have to continue innovating, otherwise they're no longer preferential, right? Because the rest of the country is catching up. So first, they just focused on attracting foreign direct investment, right? No, the rest of the country was not allowed FDI, and they were the only ones to take advantage of this, and they developed the manufacturing sector. For many adults, they think of China as the manufacturer of the world, right? Because during the 80s and 90s, the whole world benefited from cheap labor and low-grade manufacturing from China. However, this was only the target for the first 10 years. China realized, right, that as they grow, as they become less poor or richer, their wages will grow. And they cannot be the world's manufacturer or the world's source of cheap labor forever. So they had to innovate. So from the 1990s, they only offered fiscal incentives for FDI, right? Foreign companies that invested in high-tech industries. So the preferential policies changed. Before, they just want to attract any type of FDI and develop manufacturing. But then they said, okay, we don't want low-grade manufacturing anymore. And actually, many companies left China. And they left to other countries like Bangladesh or Malaysia or Myanmar, Vietnam, because they couldn't get the low-grade and cheap labor manufacturing that they once used to. And then China benefited from this industrial technological investment. And one key feature, right, is that companies are forced to share their technology. They're forced to, if you want to invest in China, you have to transfer technology to the local companies. So there are no foreign, wholly foreign direct owned companies in China, right? I think even today, there are only two companies that I can think of that are 100% foreign owned. All other companies in China have to create joint ventures. And this is the way they force companies to share the technology. And so during the 90s, the Chinese were learning, right? They were being given other foreign technology, and they were copying this technology into their own products, and they were learning. But then this is also not a sustainable model, right? Because you depend on the foreign technology. And this dependency plagues other countries, right? Other middle income countries. So after 2000, they really changed the policies to not just high tech development, but also innovation, research and innovation. And and this has been actually a similar phase until now, right? So their focus is on research, developing their own high technology, and we can see some examples, right? Well, so this is Shenzhen, and don't be fooled by the term special economic zone. Shenzhen is a city, and we can see how foreign direct investment increase in Shenzhen, and we can see the three stages, right? So the first stage is low-grade manufacturing. The second stage, and these are simplifications, right, of the categories. Second stage is high-tech development, and the third stage is R&D. So you see many research papers actually say, well, the Chinese development is fueled or driven by foreign direct investment. And this leads many economists, development economists, and other countries to actually, okay, we need foreign direct investment. But I have a critique of this, right? If you compare the foreign direct investment, this is foreign direct investment in yellow bars in Shenzhen, and this is total investment in orange. And we can see that, and this is the rate, the share, using the left axis, right? And the bars are using the right axis. We can see that only at the beginning was foreign direct investment over 50%, but it was never 100%, right? And you can see now it's less than 5%. So of course, foreign direct investment is important, but it's actually the domestic investment. The domestic investment is the larger share. So foreign direct investment was never the higher share of this total investment that drove this economic growth. So I think it's a mistake to expect foreign direct investment (FDI) to drive economic growth in developing countries. And we can see, of course, in the last stage, R&D, right? We can measure it as patent applications growth. It just took off, right? R&D, not just in Shenzhen, but all of China, in the last 20 years, has been growing at a level that rivals the US now. I think last year was the first time where patents were greater in China than in the United States. And of course, China had a lot of surplus labor, and this has also helped, right? It absorbed all the labor from surrounding regions. So this connection from the special economic zone or the preferential policy based regions to the rest of the country is very important. And we have some pictures, right? I have put the credits since they're not mine, but Shenzhen in 1979 was a fishing village. And if you go now, it's a world-class city. It's with a world-class port, right? One of the best ports, and it's just fascinating, right? You go there, and it's remarkable. You don't think you're in a middle-income country, right? And this is the same. This is true for most parts of China, like the airports, the subways. Like the infrastructure is very high level, right? And much better than I haven't seen a single, for example, subway station in Barcelona or most parts of Europe that are comparable, right, to subway stations in Shanghai, for example.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
I had this impression in 2007 when I visited China, but this is a bit nothing scary. It means that you just land in the airport and you can take a highway and drive through many beaches, the neighborhood here, for many kilometers, and then arrive to the city center. I had this experience, of course, with Shanghai, but also
Well, I don't know if everyone was able to listen to the question, but yes, okay. So,
from outside,
well,
sorry, from outside
it's become even more scarier. If you think of if scary is the word to qualify it, I've been going for the last 6 years, and every year it's so different. Like the city itself is growing. Like the streets are not the same, the buildings are not the same. It's expanding. Now there's probably high-speed rails, and that did not exist in 2007. So they have their own. I don't know how the people cope. I think this is beyond my expertise. It's a difficult question to ask because I know like in Spain you could never build a highway that crosses the natural areas like that. But there they've grown to, well, they've had to accept it for a certain part as a consequence of the development. But now this created a lot of problems, mainly pollution, and all of this discontent because of the air quality and of this very high urbanization rate has caused the government for maybe the last 10 years to reconsider changing the targets from just GDP. So there's been an emphasis on reducing not just economic growth, but reducing the contamination and the environmental effects. But actually, for the first 30 years, or maybe the first 20 years specifically, this was a consequence of the economic growth. And I'm not, it's very hard for me to speak on behalf of the people, but I think many, as long as their incomes and their lives were improving at the rate that they were, I think they accepted this as a consequence. But now that they have reached a certain level, right, the Chinese middle class has grown a lot, and the more it grows, the more they demand. So I think now you see an inflection point in the policies where they are no longer just focusing on growth, but also trying to, uh, well, keep their citizens happier, if you can say it this way. But the example of these cities, right, is that they were able to benefit from this experimental autonomy, if we can say it, right? So the preferential policies, I like to define it because the term is used widely in the literature, but it doesn't refer to the same thing. So I refer it, right? I like the definition given by Deminger and Sachs. That is basically deregulation and autonomy given to Chinese cities. Right? So it's more of a jurisdiction than actually a demarcated zone. Yes, Miss.
The professor draws a nomenclature question.
Okay, thank you. But I can do it later, but it's related. But we're
How
talking
do we listen to her
the
question?
question. Could you listen me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So my question and my point, I have a question and I want to add something with what you say before in the last slide. For me, it's clear that for the citizens of China, most of them, this is really impressive because they changed the way of life very, very fast and they improved the global system and the economy, and a lot of people can change from the poorest situation to a middle society. So it's really, and when you are there, people is happy normally, is pleased, it's funny, they love, they are well, they like this change, this fast change. And this is probably a consequence of improving their level of life. My question is, and I always have on mind when I thought in China, it's what could happen when the workers that now uh, want or work more than 8 hours a day because and they work Saturdays or Sundays, so it doesn't have any importance because they can this is for improving their life, so they like it. But what will happen when this big population, or this amount of workers can be organized in the way to ask for a better life. So that will occur, or really the Communist Party will stop that and will control that, or what is your opinion about that point? Or do you have some input on that way?
Okay, thank you for your question. Okay, I'll address it in a way. The government, I feel, is very aware of the level of content in the citizenry, and they use, of course, if you read the articles from the West, they label it as authoritarian, but they use their version of Weibo, of Twitter, sorry, which is Weibo. They are actually monitoring what the people are saying, right? And if too many people are upset with, for example, a hole in the road, and they are complaining, right? And actually, the government uses these type of mechanism to try to fix it quickly, right? But I don't know to what level they are allowed to unionize. But I know that the government is, at least the policies are not oriented in suppressing. They are trying to maintain, right? Maintain the system and appeasing the citizenry. And this, of course, is easier, like you said, when the economic growth rates are higher. And their current model is not sustainable. So they are already trying to do reforms to switch from this investment-driven and industrialization-driven model towards a consumer-driven model. And this is where this is where it becomes important, because right now the Chinese is the world's largest consumer market, and they have over 900 million internet users. But most foreign companies do not have access to this market. And actually, most Chinese consumers actually don't have many investment options, right? They are saving a lot. Their savings rate is very high, but they don't know where to invest. So this is still controlled by the Chinese government, and I think it's still an option for them to, as like you say, the citizens demand more. They still have some things they can give, because the Chinese consumers or citizens, actually, there are still many things that are out of their reach. And to what extent and
Okay, thank you.
yeah, I'll try to get back to it at the end when I have my policy implications.
Okay, thank you so much.
So let's see. So we're talking about special economic zones, but in the literature review, the definition is very difficult. And this is caused mostly because of big reports created by large organizations, and they want to encompass everything into a single world. So I would say that the Chinese special economic zones are completely different from those in the rest of the world. Right? So outside of China, the special economic zone refers to basically an export-oriented zone or export processing zone. And in China, they're actually more of a reform-oriented zone. And it's not, when I say zone, it's actually bigger. It's an entire city. Of course, within these zones, there are actually smaller zones within China. So we look at the World Bank typology, and the World Bank considers every type of zone a special economic zone. And this creates problems in the literature, because you cannot compare studies that are talking about special economic zones in different countries, because they're talking about different things. And the World Bank typology actually is a source of this problem, because they just label everything a special economic zone, whether it's a development zone, a trade zone, an enterprise zone, right? It's a special economic zone. And then we have the International Labor Organization. And for them, it's the opposite. They call every zone an export processing zone, even though And the Chinese zones are classified as an export processing zone, even though they're not just export processing or even export oriented. So this creates a lot of problem in the literature. And you can imagine I've read maybe 100 to 200 articles and books, and they're talking about different things but using the same word. So it causes a great confusion. And I concluded, well, they're not comparable. So the Chinese actually they have their own typology. So in China, they refer to special economic zone and open cities as the citywide jurisdiction, but they also have smaller zones that are more comparable to the export processing zones or development, and they call them development zones. But they're also very specialized, right? You can see that they have technological development zones or high-tech industry zones, border economic cooperation zones, right? Industrial parks, which you might be more familiar with. But these are different from the citywide jurisdictions that I'm referring to and that I consider in this study. So overall, there are about 60 cities that have preferential policies. And this is the intro on special economic zones. I talked very quickly about income inequality. Income inequality, I know it's a hot topic, but it's been increasing not just in China. Actually, all over the world, you can see that over the last 40 years, there's been a rise in income inequality. Of course, I just randomly chose how many? 33 countries that I thought could be interesting. And you can see that in most of them, you can see income inequality. This is the Gini coefficient in blue for 2019 compared to the one in 1980 in red. And in many countries, different regions, different levels of development, you can see changes in the inequality, right? I've marked the ones that decrease inequality in with the green star. But inequality is a global problem, I would say, not just for developing countries and not just for China. And I've shared the link with many of you about the study by Wilkinson, right? And if you studied at IQS, you probably seen this in one of your courses. But when you compare inequality with social problems, you can see that there's a correlation, right? And they show, for example, child well-being and just income. So the richer a country is, and you can see there's no relationship with the level of child well-being. However, if you plot the same countries, and these are only done for OECD countries, you find that the countries that have lower inequality have better child well-being. So they find this correlation, and not just for child well-being. They find it for different types of social and health problems, right? So this is a trust index. Countries with higher inequality have less trust among its population. Countries with higher inequality have higher imprisonment rates. And remember, we're talking about only developed countries, only OECD countries. And another example, even drug usage problems, right? You can see that the countries with lower inequality have less drug usage problems. And they did this index for a whole battery of social and health problems, such as life expectancy, literacy, infant mortality, homicides, and so on. And we can see that overall, and these are all developed countries, right? So all of them have similar income levels, but how the income is distributed seems to indicate whether a society, right, has more or less social problems. So it's not just about becoming rich, but about having a distribution, right, that is better. So this is one of the motivations of why I try to link the effects on inequality, right? And now comes the literature review. I'll do it in a summarized version, but I did want to show, well, I don't know, the doctoral students, what we should focus on, right? It's good to have all the related literature and classify what methodologies they're using, right? So they're predominant methodologies can be established and what their contributions are. Right? Of course, usually I have a bigger table where I also put the number of countries and the number of years. So we can see that there's a lot of research on preferential policies, but most of them are focusing on the smaller zones, right? And most of them are focusing on growth or FDI or trade. None of them are looking at inequality. And the same with inequality research. Right? There's a vast amount of studies on inequality in China, but none of them focus on whether the special economic zones had an impact or the preferential policies had an impact or not. Most of them focused on the regional disparities, right, between the east, the center, and the west, and also between urban and rural areas, and as well as gender gaps and ethnicity gaps, but none of them are focusing on this divide. But most of them, we can see the methodologies, most of them use population-based and regression-based decompositions of inequality. So because this seems to be the predominant methodology, I also apply it in my research, right? And we can see that we already run into several problems. There are different ways to measure inequality. Right? We have the most commonly known is the Gini coefficient, but the Gini has several limitations because it's very sensitive to the mean and not to the extremes. And other researchers use the Thiel index or the mean log deviation, and there are many more. There are many, maybe uh, nine common inequality indices that you can find in different articles. So how do you choose, right? I actually do for all of them the same analysis as a robustness check. And the decomposition of inequality, you can see that this methodology developed a long time ago, right, by Thiel, Bourguignon, and it's been developing. So this procedure, right, and lastly, Anthony Shorrocks is the one that does a regression-based decomposition, which is the, I'll explain it later. But there's a, outside of this literature, there's a methodological literature that is important to be familiar with. So the significance of the study, well, based on the literature review, I found the research gap. Right? Many studies analyze the effects of preferential policies on economic growth and on FDI, but not on inequality. Right? And likewise, inequality in China is explored in a lot of research, but they don't focus on the impact on preferential policies. And I put few, right? I'm one of those few because I've already published on I think 2 papers on this topic, but actually it's a very small group. So I try to explore, right? I want to decompose urban inequality into cities and with and without the preferential policy. So I just focus on the urban because there's already a lot of research doing the rural-urban divide. And if you look at developed countries, right, there's a lot of research on urban problems. So I think if we're forward-looking, looking into the future, when China is mostly urbanized and highly developed, right, the problems are going to be urban. So I think we should focus on urban from now. So my research question is very simple, very broad. What is the relationship between preferential policies and inequality in urban China? Specifically, right, relationship between preferential policies in the special economic zones and open cities. And I have to compare. I have to compare then those cities that have it, the preferential treatment, and those cities that don't have. It's similar to a natural experiment. And of course, there's a conceptual framework, how I think these preferential policies could lead to an increase in inequality, right? It could be that higher decentralization and deregulation, right, increases the incomes of those living in these cities, and they offer higher return to skills for those that are here, right? And it could be a problem, right? Because if you look at the workforce in some of these places, up to 23% are scientists, right? Because they're attracting people to come there, not just Chinese, but from all over the world. So this could create a greater variance, right, in the skill set, and therefore the inequality could be higher. But because they also invest in better employment opportunities and social welfare programs, right, and upgrading schemes for skills, And because they have more money, they have more social spending. So this could be another mechanism on how they could reduce inequality. And there are different types of inequality. I'll show how I measure it. There's inequality between cities and within cities. And of course, we don't know how some factors, right? So how do we identify the relationship of preferential policies and income inequality? Well, first we have to establish if there's actually a difference, statistically significant difference between the cities that have preferential policies and those that do not. And actually this part is the paper that has already been published, right, with my last name, 2006. So this is the first part. Otherwise, if you don't establish if the gap exists, the subsequent research is kind of pointless, right? So first we have to find that if there's a gap, and then is the gap getting bigger or smaller? Right? This could be the second step. And are there gaps for if you examine the sample, the population under different lenses? And I'll explain that, like for example, by gender or by education level. And finally, we can do a regression-based decomposition of inequality to see what causes the income inequality. So now that we have ascertained our objectives, right, for a research question, what data do we use? So there's a lot of data in China, but we want household survey data, right? This is most common for measuring inequality. And there are several survey data sets in China, but the one I decided to use is called the China Household Income Project, or the CHIP surveys. And they have several waves at about approximately every 7 years. So I think 2020, we might see another wave. And it has an urban data set, a rural data set, and a migrant data set. The urban data set covers 6,000 households and up to 20,000 individuals from 125 cities, right? And only 14 provinces. So why did I choose this data set, right? This data set was designed specifically to measure income distribution. So they asked many questions, many layers of income that I'll define later, but it's very appropriate, right? Because designed to analyze the household income in China, is designed by a collaboration of foreign universities and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. And so it's not conducted by the government. So it provides us another set of data as well. And one feature is that they include migrants. And most studies, other surveys before this, right, did not include the migrants, the rural migrants living in the urban areas. And I think by not including it, your results are a little biased. So this has one option. Of course, it's not nationally representative, but we have a little bit of everything, right? We have some coastal areas, some central regions, and some western regions. And we can see, right, the different years, 88, 95, 2002, 2007, 2013. And the next one, I'm assuming, is 2020. It's a lot of pressure because if I don't publish the results I have right now and the 2020 wave comes out, I have to rewrite everything, right? So for now, I'm lucky or unlucky, I don't know, because I haven't published everything. But it's a time sensitive, right? So I can only have results up to 2013 because of this. Yes, Pauline.
So for the paper for 2020, are you going to include something about the COVID situation then, or do you hope that if you publish it as soon as possible, you don't have to include it?
I will try to avoid COVID-related studies. Okay. Leave that to the COVID experts. But yeah, I think maybe because of the COVID, the 2020 is gonna be delayed. Yeah. So yeah, I think I try to avoid it. No. So how do you measure income? We're not just talking about wages. We're talking about household disposable income and then dividing it, right? Total household disposable income divided by the number of household members. This is the standard right now in inequality literature. And from the CHIP surveys, we have a lot of components that we consider as part of this household disposable income, right? It includes the cash income, which are the wages, but also the income of the retired members, income of non-working members, income of enterprises, of property, miscellaneous income, right? Subsidies, subsidies for rations, for housing, right? These are in-kind income, and also the rental value, right, of owner-occupied housing. So we have to calculate this household disposable income, and then we measure the inequality, right, the distribution of this household disposable income at the different levels. So I use different measures. Of course, I'll focus the main results on the Gini because it's the most comparable, even though it's the most widely used, but it's not, I would say it's not the best. And then the methodology, right? I base my methodology on the literature, and we start with the spatial decomposition of inequality. So first we divide, right? We see cities with and without preferential policies, and we divide the inequality into within region inequality and between region inequality. So the inequality between the different cities, because we're doing it at a city level, but also within the cities is very important, right? And well, this is standard, right? If you look at the literature, but I go at different levels. So I do for cities into two groups, right? Cities with preferential policy and cities without, and then an additional level by region. So we do 6 subgroups in this equation, right? We end up with 6 subgroups. Cities in the West that have preferential policy, and cities in the West that don't have preferential policy, and so on, right? In the center with and without, and in the East with and without. And like this, we can have different subgroups. So these are the spatial ones. Up to here has been published. And now I'm also looking at socioeconomic stratifications, right? This is following other literature as well. So there are literature that looks at gender dimension. HUCO, which I might not have time to explain, is the residential household registration system in China. And basically, it's similar to the Padrón in Spain, right? The Padrón. And I won't explain more. Actually, there's a lot to say about the HUCO, but also by age group. So different age cohorts. This is very important because the country has undergone so many reforms that different people were exposed to different policies. For example, compulsory education did not start until 1986. So before 1986, you were not forced to go to middle school, right? Elementary school, middle school, and I guess not high school, right? But this part, so different age groups have benefited from different policies. So it's very important to also analyze by age group, cohort, and also by education group, right? If people have different levels of educational attainment, then maybe they should earn more, right? If you study more, someone with a master maybe should expect to earn more than someone without even a college degree. So there are some types of inequalities that we would expect, right? Someone that has worked maybe for 20 years should earn more money than someone is just graduating high school, for example. And someone with a university degree or a master degree should earn more than someone without a degree. So there are certain types of inequalities that we should try to control for. So I try to do it for age as well as education. And finally, so once we measure the different inequality subgroups, we run a regression for each of these subgroups. And the regression is a standard OLS. And the reason why we're trying to run this regression is not to find the causality per se, or the relationship here per se, but we want to create some, how do we call them, cash flows, right? Income flows based on the explanatory variables. So, and I'll give an example of this. And using the coefficients of that regression for each of those variables, we then multiply the coefficient to each of the values of those variables for each of the individuals. And I'll give an example, right? So maybe, well, we have income, right? We have income, and let's say education is one of the variables. Of course, we have many. We have education, whether the people are married or single, their ethnicity, their wages, no, not their wages, sorry, their location. I'll show all the variables I use, but let's say education. So we find the coefficient for education, which will tell us, right, a magnitude, right, of how much education contributes to overall income. But then we multiply that coefficient times the education level of that person, and we get a cash flow, right? So this amount of income comes from education. This amount of income comes from a gender, right? And it could be a negative income flow. And then for all of the income flows, we have an income flow actually for every explanatory variable. And then we can measure inequality. Oops, and
I could hear.
I lost the screen. Please be patient. I lost the screen on my computer and on the projector. Well, on the projector, right? How about in the computer is fine.
Otherwise you can.
Okay, I'll stop sharing and share again. I apologize. But now in Teams it doesn't appear, right? It appears.
But there's a Graciano move and now it is. And now it disappears. Now it disappears.
Ah, my Teams crashed.
Why is what the Wi-Fi?
Not everyone's being screwed. Yeah, it was frozen.
Okay, I apologize for that. My Microsoft Teams crashed and I didn't realize it, and that's why something wasn't working. Okay, so hopefully we're back on track. Hopefully the sound works. And hopefully you heard my lengthy explanation on how we create income flows attributable to different explanatory variables by using the regression coefficients. And now that we have an income flow for every explanatory variable, we can measure inequality for each of these income flows. And this last part is very simple because this is the inequality for the income flow divided by overall inequality. So it gives us the share of inequality for different explanatory factors. And this is what we're gonna base our policy implications, at least for this line of research. And I'll show you a little bit of everything, right? I think we're good on time. So this is what's already been published, actually, up to here. So the statistically significant differences. Of course, I didn't want to show tables, right? If you look at the paper, you'll only see a bunch of tables with statistical significance indicators. And I think for a presentation, it's nicer to present the graph. So we can see, and maybe I can zoom in. So basically, this is how we measure using equation 1, inequality for cities with preferential policy and other cities. And we have inequality represented on the lines, right, using the Gini and the left axis, and the columns represent the mean income per capita using the right axis. So I try to put everything into one graph, and we can see that there's a gap. There's a distinguishable gap where inequality is lower and actually diverging at one point, right, for the cities with preferential policies. And there's also an income gap. So there's an inequality gap shown in the lines and an income gap. All of these are statistically significant. I don't show the significance here, but we just want to illustrate there's a gap. There's a gap, and the income gap is growing. Right? You can see incomes are growing everywhere, right? Which is good for urban China, but it's growing at a faster rate in the cities with preferential policy. And inequality has reduced from 95 to 2002 only in cities with preferential policy. And this is important because most research just shows that it reduced in urban compared to rural. But when I separate the cities, I can show that it only reduced in some cities and not others. And this is statistically significant, and this is the basis for the further research. So this was the step one. And we can also do by region, right? So we can look at the different regions, west, center, and east, and we see the same, right? There is an income gap. Of course, the columns represent income. There's an income gap. Of course, in some regions, it's much higher, right, than in others. You can see the coastal region has a lesser gap than the central and western, and you can see the trends for inequality. There's an inequality gap for each of the regions as well. So this is what has already been published, but we can see that I continue to do now by socioeconomic stratifications. So we can see now by gender, right? And here it's very interesting. We compare, of course, male and female within the subgroups. So we see males and females in cities with special preferential policies and as well as other cities. And actually there is an income gap. You don't see it quite well, right? We have actually income on the last two columns and inequality in the first two columns. So there is an income gap and there actually is an inequality gap. It's not that big. This gap has been reducing actually. But when we compare, and how do I say the term? When we compare between regions, but in the same stratification, so when we compare males in special economic zones and open cities to males in other cities, we see that the gaps are higher, right? So the males in the special cities with preferential policy have higher income, and the inequality, right, the distribution is also lower. And the same happens with females. When we compare females in cities with preferential policy, they have higher incomes than the females living in other cities. And also the inequality is much lower, right? Inequality is these first two columns. You can see that the inequality is, well, it's significantly lower. We do this by different social economic groups, and we get the same result. So we do it by hukou, we do it by age, we do it by education. So if we look at the age groups, and maybe I can zoom in, or maybe it's fine. So we have income on the top graph and income inequality on the bottom graph using the Gini. Right? So we can see age groups for every single age group. Those that are living in special economic zones and open cities have higher income than their cohort that are living in other cities. And the same for inequality. For every single age group, those that reside in cities with preferential policy have lower inequality than those residing outside. So we're trying to find a case where it's not true, but we cannot find it, right? We cannot find it, at least not with these socioeconomic indicators. And the same with education. So this is income, and you see the story I told at the beginning, right? The higher education you have, the higher income you should have. And this is true whether you live in a city with preferential policies or not. But when you compare them, right, those with, for every education group, those living in cities with preferential policy have higher incomes and lower inequality than their counterparts living in other cities. And then we go to the regressions, right? And I use, because we have, about 20,000 observations per year, right? We use many explanatory variables. And I'm just gonna summarize a few of them, but we have like the percentage of working age males, mean age of the working age males, average education, average experience, health conditions, ethnic minority, household size, whether the household head is female, and all of these are based on actually other literatures that they say these indicators might be important, and also based on the availability of data. Whether they're party members, temporary workers, tertiary education, if they receive household subsidies and others, right? And we also do many dummies. We have about, I forget, we have about 20 industry dummies and different occupational dummies and other types of ownership dummies. And the regression results look like this. These are the estimates, right? And it's a cross section, right? Unfortunately, the CHIP surveys does not give us a panel, so we have to analyze them separately. And what I've done is using the decomposition, right, groups, I've separated them into subgroups. So we have special economic zones for every year, 98, 88, and other cities for every year, right? And I don't show all the years. I just show 88, 2002, and 2013. We're missing 2 of the years. So we can see that the significance changes for years, and this is important, right? Because some things might be significant in one year and then not significant in another year. And because China's economy and social system is transforming, it makes sense that the influential variables are also not static, right? They change. And we can see that our model also, and I'm not sure how well, maybe I can zoom in. Our model, right, we just look at the R squared, explains to a higher rate some years, for example, 95 compared to 88. This is after most of the market-oriented reforms have occurred, right? And around 30%, right, of the variation in the last year. So there's an increase of the explanatory power of our model, of the variables we're using. And these are for the dummies, right? We can see I've highlighted a few because there were some notable differences. So these differences, right, I've highlighted the industry. So manufacturing, whether the household works in manufacturing, they work in retail, they work for a state-owned enterprise, and you have others, right, such as finance. So for each of these, you could actually try to explain something, but due to time limitations, maybe I'll choose manufacturing. So we can see manufacturing is negatively correlated with income in special economic zones, if we just look at the last year, but positively correlated in other cities. What does that mean? That people living in cities with preferential policy, those with higher incomes are not working in manufacturing. But that is not true in other cities. And this is more consistent of the reforms that are happening in China, right? China is trying to move away from manufacturing and they're moving towards service, right? Which is consistent with developed regions. So we can already see that this result highlights or exemplifies that the cities with preferential policy are better suited for the upcoming reforms, that they already don't depend on manufacturing, right? If this is one way to interpret it. And we see a similar relationship with construction. Construction, which I didn't highlight, is here, right? But construction is not significant. Even though we have a negative coefficient, is not significant in special economic zones and open cities, but it is, and is positively correlated in other cities. So other cities depend on construction. Maybe they're still expanding, but there's already a limit and a downturn in construction. And China is moving away from this investment-led growth. So it's already clear, right, that these cities are not going to be impacted as hard when they reduce manufacturing and construction, which is already happening, right? The government has already indicated a reduction in these. And we can see in the service areas, right? Service, which is retail, is one example. Retail is positively related in cities with preferential policies. And this makes sense, right? Consumer growth, right? Service-led growth and consumption-led growth, and these, but not significant, and with a negative coefficient in other cities. So these cities seem already to reflect what would be a consumer-led society. And we have other results, but I will move along since there's a lot. I will skip a lot actually. And then we have our equation number 10, which, so using these coefficients from this regression tables, we create the income flows and measure inequality for each of these explanatory variables. And then we divide it by overall inequality, and we get the share, which we call the contribution of the explanatory variable to overall inequality. And of course, we have this table, and the columns represent the same, right? Cities with preferential policy for each of the years, and cities without. And I've selected 3 of the sample years. And we can see whether the contribution changes. We can already see, right? Location and tertiary education are the highest contributors. Location is consistent with the other research, right? There's a lot of research showing the regional disparities, and we would expect location to be a contributor. However, when we compare the trend, you can see that location, although increases for a while, it starts to decrease, and it's significantly lower in cities with preferential policy compared to cities without. Right? So the regional disparities are less in the cities with preferential policy, and the same occurs with tertiary education. Actually, the opposite. The opposite. Tertiary education contributes more in cities with preferential policy than in other cities. And of course, the table is, I don't like these tables for presenting, so I've done this graph, right? These bar graphs, which with the contribution of each, and it adds up to 100, which I think is important because sometimes we have negative contribution, and many papers just omit, they also omit the residuals. But we can see that location is no longer a major contributor, and we can see that none of them are static. And I think this is an important contribution to the literature and for policymakers. So the contributing factors to inequality are changing, they're dynamic. And this is important because, well, if location was a problem before, and there are many policies, like the Chinese have been investing a lot in the Western regions, right? The lesser development regions, they've been investing a lot in developing their economies and their education and their health. So maybe these policies have had an effect. And that's why the success of these policies has reduced the contribution of location, but that doesn't mean that other problems are not there, right? So they should focus on other problems. Right? It brings to light other problems, which in this case are household related or occupation related, right? So we can see the industrial composition and the education, right, and occupation are becoming important factors. And I think this opens up a line for further research. And actually, I do have a paper on this, on the different occupational and industrial composition and the relationship to overall inequality. But I think this is as far as we go for today's presentation. So just as a discussion, right, or summarize, we see that income is higher in cities with preferential policies across all regions and throughout all years. The income gap is increasing, right? We also see that income inequality is lower. And, well, we see that preferential policies, right? Cities with preferential policies have achieved higher incomes and lower inequality than all other cities. And this is true for all regions and for all socioeconomic stratifications. So, and this is very unexpected, actually. When I began this research, I did not expect to get this result. I expected the opposite. But no matter how I try to analyze and scrutinize, it's very consistent result. So actually, these cities have achieved higher income and lower inequality, right? Growth with reducing inequality. And it's very important. And I think it's an important implication for the reforms that the country is trying to do, right? I think that they should implement more of these policies in the rest of the country at a faster pace. And of course, I talk about, right, the returns to different types of education and manufacturing and finance. I won't discuss this much, and we have implications for China, of course. Right, the economy is going through a new period of growth. They call it the new normal growth, but it's still very high. Even now, with the COVID, the Chinese economy is expected to grow, I think, between 4 and 6%, while other countries are all negative, right? They're still growing very fast, and they're going through what they call supply side reforms, right? That means going from investment and industry economy towards consumption and service. And we can already see, right, that the cities with preferential policy are better suited for this type of reform. And other cities might actually suffer from these reforms, right, or have some consequence. And we have policy implications for Europe, right? It's very important because China is actually expanding their influence. They're growing very fast. They have a overcapacity and oversupply of so many things that they're starting to export, right? They created their new development bank, which is equivalent to a World Bank. They have their own World Bank. It's called the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and they're investing all over the world, right? And they also have the One Belt, One Road initiative that reaches Europe, right? They are actually building railroads from China, and most of them have already been built, actually, that goes from China to Europe. And they can ship containers from China to Europe in 2 weeks. And by sea, it takes an average of a month. So this is already opening up, especially for the western areas of China that don't have access to ports. They will be able to export. And they're actually investing, well, you can read the news, right? Chinese companies are investing in Europe, and it's a national concern in some countries. And China, again, I think I said it at the beginning, has the world's largest consumer market, right? 900 million internet users. And this is largely closed to foreign companies. European companies do not have access to this market, right? Many Western companies have tried to access the Chinese consumer market with no success. And you can think, right, you have 900 million users. If you sell €1 to each of them for an app, you have instantly 900 million euros, right? This will change. China is gradually opening, and in this decade, right, the 20s, this consumer market will be open to the world. So this is a big opportunity for European companies to sell to the new Chinese middle class, the new Chinese consumer market. So the more we understand about it, the better we can target. So these are the implications. Well, we have implications for developing countries. My discipline is actually international development. That's why, but I won't focus on these. And that's it for my presentation, right? I apologize if it takes too long. I probably elaborated a lot, but since it's the first time I present on this topic, I thought it was important to highlight some things over others. And the contributions, right, are not just the results, but also the contribution to the literature. And I've put the references for you that have the slides. And in the references, you can find you can find my paper that has already been published and videos by Paul Romer, which I think are very inspiring. So thank you very much for your attention and patience, and that's it.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a short question or like conclusion that you just discussed. So I know you don't want to think about the COVID situation, but as you said, of course it's going to be China is a great exporter, and now you said that they will focus on China and into the increasing demand in the other cities, but I think the news already said, or already first studies show that the export to other countries is going to decrease in the future, since all countries are in lockdown and don't need the supplying them massive things or whatever from China. So do you think you also want to have a look if the demand in China is going to increase even more, so because they can't export to other countries, or if China is going to change something in their export method or anything?
Okay.
It's going to change it more and increase it more.
It was affected by the lockdowns, but it actually already recovered to pre-lockdown levels. There's an indicator, an index for exports, I think. But yeah, it's not about the export. Their transition is from changing from an export-oriented and manufacturer-oriented to consumer-oriented. So the manufacturing, and this is because as the Chinese employees, right, become better paid, so their wages go higher, and it's not going to be profitable enough for many companies to keep producing in China. And the same thing happened in many European countries and in the United States, for example, that most of their manufacturing went to other countries. The same will happen in China, right? A lot of manufacturing will go to other countries, and they will still be profitable, right? Maybe Chinese companies will manufacture in other companies, and only the high tech, high grade, right? These certain technology industries will keep producing. So I think in this case, maybe it even helps. It helps the situation, the pandemic lockdowns have helped to move these reforms along, because sometimes it's very difficult to close down companies and reduce manufacturing and reduce construction. But when you're forced to do it, but if you wanted to do it anyways, I think it's not going to be that hurtful, since it's already in their long-term or medium short-term plan, right, to reduce their exports, reduce the manufacturing. And actually, just because they reduce doesn't mean that they won't export. It means that hopefully they'll import more, right? They'll import more than what they export, and the whole composition of their economy will change. But we're talking about the next 10 years. So it's good to, I guess, if you have an idea, right, a business idea, to start thinking about, well, the Chinese market, right? No, I don't know if that answers your question. I don't know if everyone can listen to the questions. I cannot listen.
I have a silly question, which is, and if nobody has Flavio has a question. I let Flavio ask your smart question, Flavio, please.
No, it can be after you, please.
Now, my silly question was, what did you find that is not good in these cities? Is there what problems there's also this, or because as when you present it, everything sounds nice, okay? So what is the dark face of the cities?
Okay, thank you for your question. It's an interesting question, because I did an interview for a newspaper in Australia. And after the interview finished, they asked me the same thing. And then in the paper, they only published the bad thing and none of the good things. And I guess, yes, I didn't intend it to be this way. I just ran my analysis, right? I had my objective, my analysis, and these are the things that are appearing. So it's an unexpected result, and it goes a little bit against the current. I'm sure there are many negative things if we want to look for them, both in the country and in these zones and everything. But from my research, it's not there, right? It's not there. So the inequality seems to be reducing. Maybe it's bad that it's only reducing in these cities and not the other. Maybe you could interpret this as a bad thing. But I'm sure there are many problems, right? Every country has problems, every society has problems. So and I'm sure they have problems of their own as well.
At growth and inequality, everything is the way you have described it.
Yeah, well, I was expecting to have some negative conclusions, but it's good to see that this is if it works there, I think it can work in other countries. This experimental based, I really like it that they experiment with a policy and then they have evidence. Of course, there are moral implications for some policies, right? But I think it's a good approach, or it's a novel approach. Maybe it's not good for them, right? If you're not receiving the treatment, but I don't know. I think for now the results are limited to what I have presented.
Thank you. Okay, Flavio, go.
Okay, no, thank you. I think everyone will agree that it's very impressive, all the statistical work that you have done. I think in terms of decomposing results, checking the trends. So you have done everything that data will allow. But my question is about the mechanisms which are behind, because if you define, as you have defined, preferential areas for deregulation, it's still a little bit mysterious for me that deregulation can do all the trick. It's true that you have also mentioned about the investment that they have done. But other countries do that. The European Union does that in a terms of planned way, organized way as well. So what's the theory of change? What is behind that? Because I still cannot understand what the regulation is doing. I can understand the bit that Acemoglu and Robinson can sell about giving incentives to people, but in capitalist economies, you also have incentives. So, and this is not doing the trick for those kind of rates. So what are the mechanisms there? Because this is still a little bit of mystery for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Flavio. And yes, it's a very good question, and actually, it's very difficult to give an answer. But I think we have to focus on the context first. I said at one point there is more than one China, right? Because we still have the state-managed economy in many regions, and we have state-owned enterprises and that are very inefficient, right? But they receive a lot of the government funding, and then we have the market-oriented economy. So we have this dual track economy. We have two economies in one country, and the mechanism itself, right? I'm not sure what spurs, right? Of course, the FDI is one point because they attract many technology companies and force them to share the technology. And this is very interesting because most companies don't want to share technology. Right? So the incentives that they offer these companies to share the technology must be a reason, right? And then their capacity. So from what I understand, in some of the cities, right, or economic zones, these companies are forced to hire Chinese scientists and Chinese high-skilled labor with a short-term contract. So they cannot hire them for more than 3 years, I think. And then these people that work in these foreign companies, high-tech companies, have to go and start their own companies after working in the foreign-owned company or in the foreign-owned joint venture, and so on and so on. So this transfer of knowledge is actually very top-down in the sense that the government is forcing the local governments, actually. It's not the central government doing this. These are the local, of these 60 cities, right, the local administration that are trying to figure out different ways, and they're not all doing the same. which is also why it makes it difficult. They're not all doing the same policies, but they're all striving to compete with each other. So they're competing with each other and they're forcing this transfer of knowledge, which I think was very important at the beginning. I think now some of the Chinese companies, right, don't depend on the foreign companies. And we see it put to the test with the Huawei and the United States administration battle, right? They sense a fear in the Huawei, right? Because they already have the 5G technology and telecommunications very quickly, right? So they depend. They realize all the Huawei technology depends on U.S. Semiconductors. So they put this ban and the operating system too, right? All the Huawei software was based on the Google operating system. So that's where this tension comes from. And this is where it's put to the test, right? Do they really depend on the foreign companies or can they develop their own software infrastructure, right? Or their own semiconductors? So I'm not sure what the mechanism is. I think it's important to highlight that it's not just about growth, right? Most of the innovations, and we call them innovations because maybe when you compare them to the rest of the world, they're not innovations. But when you compare it to the rest of China, welfare compensation packages were not available, right? So you have your salary and that's it. But in the cities with preferential policy, they were the first to say, no, we're going to have a base salary and then we're going to compensate based on performance. Right, and this might be normal in many Western countries, but in China it was an innovation, and it allowed them to be more competitive, right, compared to the other regions, and they allowed them to attract highly skilled local and also foreign workers, which is what you see, right, when you think about, let's say, the United States, maybe not now, recently, but you think of it where highly skilled workers go to, right? And they're trying to do the same, but they're trying to do it. Well, they also do it at a global level, but they've been doing it at a local level. They've been fighting this brain gain, brain drain war, right? Fighting for skilled talent by offering different incentives. And it's very competitive, right? You can imagine there's a lot of people in China. There's over there's a lot of people. Is 1.3 billion. I think the last census, which was 10 years ago. So it's very competitive. When you go to a university and you have a classroom of 30 students or maybe 100 students, right? Each of these students had to be the top in their class in high school for them to reach to the university level because there aren't enough universities. So when you go to just a normal university classroom, you're talking to the best already. And it's everywhere, right? When it's not just at the university level, but at in the employees and companies, there's a lot of competition. And this is also a contrast with our societies, which I think we still don't understand. But but I think it's somehow answering your question. I think it's a good avenue for further research to try to explore these mechanisms, but I'm not sure with data limitations how feasible it is. But it's there, at least for a book, right? It's there.
Okay, thank you so much.
So we have a question from Enrique Garcia Caballero.
Yes, hi. I'm just a third year student, but I had the question when I was thinking my question when you were doing your presentation. And don't you think that also the special economic zones, because if the fact they are growing faster than the other zones, is this promoting those zones that don't have these preferential policies is not causing that these zones are an inequality that is growing? Do you think?
Yes, actually, the national level inequality is not entirely caused by this, but I think when you see the between region inequality, yes, right? The cities with the preferential policy are much richer than the others, and this directly is a source of inequality. But what I'm focusing on, this is by design, right? Because they are allowed to have the preferential policy, they're allowed to become richer first. But when the government decides, okay, now we will apply this policy that only belonged to them and now belongs to the whole country, the country can actually catch up. So this, by design, is a source of disparity. And that's why I try to focus what is happening, because it's a jurisdiction, right? It's an entire city. What is happening to the people that are living inside this city? And I didn't explain about the huco before. I said it was like the padron, but it's actually like a passport within a country. So if you live, if I say Barcelona, for example, if you live in Barcelona and you want to move to Madrid, you can't, right? Because you need permission to move. So the migration is very controlled, and the people that live in a city actually are benefiting specifically from the policies of these cities. And if you migrate to a city that you don't belong to, you don't have access to like the healthcare, like education and other services, because it's very controlled. It's like a passport within a country. So all of these are factors, and you're right. It is a cause for the global inequality of the whole country, but not what is happening within, right? Because the policies are enacted at the city level. So I think we should analyze what is happening to the residents in each of these cities. And I think they should promote more, right? Allow more regions to have these types of policies so they can have a lesser inequality as well.
Okay, thank you so much.
We have Manuel Morillas.
Yes. Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Octaviano. I have two lateral questions, if you allow me. Regarding the items that you've measured, I'm interested if items or issues like alcohol consumption, crime, drug use has been measured in these parameters. Probably the answer is no, because these are secret questions, those are top. But probably alcohol consumption, which is a variable that you can measure, there is a difference between the special economic zones and the non-specific zones. I mean, something that to say that there is an increase in bad habits. And another one is completely unrelated to this, but I'm wondering if you are thinking in the long-term future of this research pipeline, thinking which entities outside the academia may be interested in following and supporting this research pipeline, and thinking in public entities in Spain and in Europe, Tedeti and Axio, which are supporting companies in China, and also the European Parliament of the Council of Regions in Europe, who may be interested in following up, such as an expert advice to these public bodies in Spain and in Europe to say, our companies are interested in funding, financing in China. How can we learn more about it? It's meaning that bringing new stakeholders into the outside the academia into this interesting research pipeline. It's like investing into the future to support further this research.
Thank you for your question, Manuel. And they're very good questions. For the first one, I didn't focus. I think I have the results somewhere. There is, well, I estimated those in poor health, right? And we have, yeah. So the cities with preferential policy, how do I use? There is a linkage between their incomes and working members that are in poor health. So there's a significant result. I didn't look at this variable for my conclusions, so I guess I could look at it again, right? But it's a significant result for the special economic zones and not for the others. And for the other question, I think is very important what you said. I just moved to Spain 3 years ago, so I don't know. I don't know who is interested in my research. Well, I do know, but I'm not in the stakeholders that you mentioned that I think is very important, and I will try. I will try to find uh, different stakeholders, whether they are government agencies or these agencies that promote enterprises that want to invest in China, for example, and to communicate my results with them. I understand the IQS also has Fundación Empresas, right? They have a network of companies, and many of them actually invest in China. So um, this research, maybe for the long in the medium term, should go on for like another 4 years. So hopefully, I can find. I do have the funding for 2 years, and I can find in this time some ways to communicate to these different organizations and see if they're interested in promoting the research as well. I've never done this, so to be honest, so I will think about it, and I appreciate the comment. Gerard?
Yes, hello. Good afternoon. I have two questions. Um, so the first one is concerning the fact that the special economic zones have a better and stronger economy compared to the normal regions. One second. Yeah, excuse me. So, do you not think that implementing these policies all over the country would obviously, from my point of view, be better for the Chinese economy? Obviously, at the beginning, they didn't do this because, as you said, as you explained, they were trying to observe the impact of these new policies, and then if they didn't go as well as expected, then the rest of the country was not influenced by it. But once these special economic zones started growing and more cities have this condition, don't you think that in fact applying this condition to the whole country um, would be better? And the second question, which is related to it, is well, I think that first I would like to answer this one, and then I'll ask you the second one. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your question. And at first, I did think about this, but then the more you read about the Chinese culture and their business culture, they don't do things that quickly, right? They think very long term. So when you do a business plan, like if you want to open a company right now, like a foreign company in China, you need to present a 25-year business plan and a 50-year one. And I think for most Western companies, that is unheard of because in the West, it's most short-term vision, right? We think about profits in the next quarter or in the next 2 to 3 to 5 years, and at most you're thinking, where are you going to be in 10 years? But the West usually has a short-term vision, and in China, they're really actually focusing on very long-term vision. So their goals are 25 years from now, 50 years from now, and they actually put it into writing. You can see their plans, right? They have 5-year plans and long-term plans, and I think for them it's important to do it gradually and try to manage as best as they can all of these disparities and problems that are arising. So yeah, I at first was an advocate. They should all implement these policies at the same time. But if you think about it, it would eliminate this mechanism that they have of experimenting. And I think this experimentation is key for them to have evidence-based policies, which I think in most countries we don't have this evidence-based policy. So once you have the evidence for a policy, it's difficult for someone to say it doesn't work. So I think it's good that they implement it like that. Of course, I would like to see the inequality to go down in the other areas, but I don't know. It must be difficult to run that country. So I hope that answers your first question.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Personally, I agree with what you said. And the second question is, do you think that maybe, I don't know if it's a little bit risky to relate these two aspects, but do you think that maybe one of the reasons why they're not implementing these policies all around the country is because perhaps they could lose maybe a little bit of influence and power that they perhaps have in the regions which are not special economic zones, and maybe they are afraid to I don't know, lose a little bit of control or influence, such as we've seen in Hong Kong and special economic zones.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think they have a lot of control anyways, right? They're very advanced in the facial recognition. So when I'm in China and I watch TV and on the news, they always show the burglars that get caught. And it's very interesting because someone might steal a wallet in the subway and the police are just tracking him through all the cameras. They must have cameras everywhere. They're tracking them through the subway, into the street, into the corner, into another building, and then he thinks he got away, but they're still tracking him, and then they arrest him. And that always surprised me. Like I don't imagine that in Barcelona, right? We get our wallets stolen, our phones stolen, and I got my phone stolen last December, and it had the Find My iPhone on. And I went to the police and I said, my phone is here. It appears on the map. And the police here didn't do anything. They're like, well, no, we cannot go in there because of some law. And I'm sure in China would have the phone back, right? I think they have a lot of control and it's fueled by AI and all of this. So I'm not sure to what extent they're afraid of losing control. But like we said at the beginning, I think as long as they can keep the economy growing and improving their citizens' welfare, they don't have to worry about that. So, but I don't know. I don't know. To be honest, it's difficult to comment on what is happening in their minds, right?
Yeah, right. Thank you.
Okay, I've been told we have a class in this room at 5, so this will be the last question. I see Felix has a question, please. Can you hear him?
No.
I cannot hear you, Felix. No, he was speaking, I think.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, excellent.
Oh, perfect. So thanks for your presentation. I just have two small questions. The first is about, let's say, the reliability of the data coming from China, especially growth data and GDP. So as we know, sometimes the data came under suspicion. And I just was checking on the web, and for example, at the beginning of the year, the Financial Times said that China's economy is 12% smaller than official data says, and other, let's say, reliable sources. So what do you think about that? And this also in relation to the second question, since you have a lot of data from or gathered in China, do you think this is kind of a limitation, or how do you deal with that in your research? Knowing about that maybe the data is, I don't know, maybe sometimes reliable or not?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I think even if it's 12% lower, it's still significantly higher. And when you go there, it seems to. I don't know. Like I'm always shocked to see the advances. Every year I go, and it's so different than the previous year. Like noticeable differences. And I focus on technological advances. So I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure if the GDP data is completely. I know they calculate it a different way than Western governments do. So maybe those differences can be from the calculation method. But I try to focus on people's lives instead of the macro analysis. And the data I'm using is household surveys conducted by a collaboration of international universities. So, and actually, the data compared to the government data is different too. So the results using the household survey shows lower inequality than what the government is reporting. So there is some discrepancy between the official report and these surveys, which I don't know how important they are. Of course, it's a data limitation. Like measurement error is gonna be present in most research, and it's good for you to acknowledge it, right? You use the best available data and try to use different analysis, right? Different robustness. If you see all the different type of analysis I did, I try to see if I change something, I get different results, and that kind of ensures that you're not mistaken, right? Or that the results are not driven by some measurement error, but you cannot avoid it. You always have some measurement error, some sampling bias, and it's good to acknowledge it. I think, and they're kicking us out of the room. So I think we need to. I think they have a master's
All
class
right.
here.
Thank you for the answer.
We will continue the discussion. Thank you.
It's an appeal for the next seminar. So keep your questions, and we will be together in 1 month from now, and we can go on with our discussions and with other research topics. Thank you very much for attending these sessions, and see you in 1 month. Bye-bye.
Bye.
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 Bye. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye bye. Bye bye.